She tried to discredit him on live TV. His response. It changed everything. The email came late in the afternoon, a short, formal message from the producers of The Morning Exchange, one of the most watched talk shows in the country. They wanted Darius Bell, tech entrepreneur and CEO of Innovis, to be a guest on their upcoming segment about diversity in business. Darius had seen this play before. A mainstream platform suddenly remembering black entrepreneurs exist, trotting them out for a few minutes of applause before moving on to the next trending topic. But this was different. Innovis wasn't some upstart. They had just secured a multi-million-dollar defense contract, outbidding some of the biggest names in the industry. That wasn't luck. That was 2 decades of relentless work. Still, he hesitated before accepting. Something felt off. His assistant, Tasha, picked up on his hesitation. "You sure you want to do this? You know how these shows are. They love a success story, but they love tearing one down even more." Darius leaned back in his chair. "I'll handle it. Besides, it's national exposure. Let's see what they have to say." Tasha exhaled, shaking her head. "Just don't let them bait you." He nodded, though deep down he knew the game. If this interview was a setup, they were playing chess with the wrong man. The morning of the interview, Darius arrived at KXNT Studios in Los Angeles. The air in the green room was cool, sterile. A young producer greeted him, barely looking up from her clipboard. "Mr. Bell, thanks for being here. We'll mic you up in 5. No small talk, no warm-up. Just in and out, like a transaction." As he sat in the makeup chair, an assistant powdered his face with practiced indifference. The monitor on the wall showed the live broadcast of the show, a panel segment on celebrity scandals, followed by a cooking demo. Then a transition card. Coming up next, the black tech boom. Is it talent or special treatment? Darius clenched his jaw. So this was the angle. But if they thought they had the upper hand, they were in for a surprise. But he wouldn't realize just how far they were willing to go. The set of The Morning Exchange was designed to look inviting. Soft blues and golds, a glass coffee table between the host's chair and the guests. Cameras hovered like silent observers, capturing every movement, every expression. Darius adjusted his suit jacket as he took his seat across from Madeleine Royce, the show's lead anchor. A seasoned journalist with a reputation for asking tough questions. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Darius Bell," she began, her voice smooth, practiced. "CEO of Innovis. A true American success story." Darius gave a polite nod. "Appreciate you having me." She leaned in slightly, flipping through her cue cards. "Now, let's get right into it. Your company recently landed a $200 million government contract, beating out some of the biggest names in tech. That's impressive." Darius knew this game. Build him up first. Make it seem like they respected his achievements. He gave a measured response. "It was a long process. But yeah, we put in the work. We developed a security encryption system that outperformed our competitors. Simple as that." Madeleine crossed her legs. "Some have called it groundbreaking." A subtle pause. "But others have raised questions." Darius didn't flinch. "Questions?" She picked up a card, reading aloud. "Some industry experts say Innovis benefited from certain federal diversity incentives, that companies like yours have an edge in these contracts because agencies are looking to diversify their vendors. That perhaps this wasn't just about being the best, but about meeting a quota." There it was. The real reason he was here. Darius let a beat pass before he responded. "I've heard that argument before. It's funny, though. When a black entrepreneur wins, it's special treatment. But when a legacy firm run by the same families for generations lands those same deals, nobody questions it." The air in the studio shifted. The producers, off camera, glanced at each other. Madeleine held her ground. "So, you're saying race played no role at all in your success?" Darius chuckled, shaking his head. "Let me ask you this. When SpaceX won its NASA contracts, was it because Elon Musk met a diversity quota? When Jeff Bezos landed government deals for Blue Origin, Was it because of his background? Or do we only ask that question when the CEO looks like me? Madeline's expression barely flickered. So you don't believe these diversity programs help? Darius folded his hands. They help level the playing field. But what people don't realize is, the playing field was never level to begin with. But Madeline wasn't done yet. She had something else up her sleeve. Madeline's smile sharpened, like a blade hidden in silk. She glanced at her cue cards, then back up at Darius. "Well, Darius, let's talk about that playing field you mentioned," she said, her tone shifting from polite curiosity to something a little colder. "You grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. Single mother, public school, worked your way up from nothing. That's inspiring." Darius gave a slow nod, sensing where this was going. Madeline continued. "But here's what some might wonder. How does someone with no Ivy League background, no deep family connections, go from a struggling neighborhood to securing contracts that billion-dollar corporations failed to land?" She let the question hang in the air. The implication was clear. How did you get here? Did someone pull strings? Darius tilted his head slightly, as if considering his words carefully. "It's called work, Madeline. Some of us don't have generational wealth or country club networks to fall back on, so we build from the ground up." Madeline gave a small nod, like she was hearing him. But she wasn't listening. "But surely you had help along the way," she pressed. "Maybe a mentor, a program, something that gave you an extra push." Darius exhaled quietly. "Yeah. Help came in the form of working 3 jobs while getting my engineering degree. Help came in the form of sleeping in my office while I built my first software prototype because I couldn't afford rent. That's the help I got." Her lips pressed together for a fraction of a second. The producers, standing behind the cameras, were locked in now. Madeline shuffled her cue cards again. And yet. Some would argue that black entrepreneurs today have more opportunities than ever before. That programs like affirmative action, minority business grants, and government incentives exist specifically to open doors that weren't open decades ago. Darius leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "You know what's funny? When a black business owner succeeds, people always ask what programs helped us. But nobody asks which old money bank helped fund a white-owned startup. Nobody asks which family connections got them into Stanford, or which golf buddy invested in their company." He let that sink in for a second before continuing. "The truth is, success isn't handed out in some lottery. People like me had to be twice as good just to get a seat at the table." A noticeable shift in the room. The quiet tension of an audience realizing they were watching something real unfold. Madeline, however, didn't blink. Instead, she smiled, the way a chess player smiles when they think they've just cornered their opponent. "That's an interesting perspective," she said, voice smooth as glass. "But let's address another factor. Perception." She turned slightly toward the cameras. "Darius, you present yourself as a self-made success. But let's talk about the public perception of your story. Some say that black entrepreneurs get an unfair advantage when it comes to media attention, that the narrative of overcoming struggle is more marketable than the thousands of white business owners who work just as hard but don't get the same headlines." Darius let out a quiet chuckle. "Oh, so now we get too much attention?" Madeline kept her polished smile, but a slight shift in her posture gave her away. She wasn't expecting him to laugh. "You're telling me that in a world where 90% of Fortune 500 CEOs are white men, where major tech funding still overwhelmingly goes to white-owned startups, the real issue is that people like me get too much press?" Madeline tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "I'm just pointing out that in today's climate, some people feel there's pressure to highlight diversity over pure merit." Darius exhaled, shaking his head. "Merit, right." He glanced briefly at the cameras, then back at her. "Let me ask you something, Madeline. Do you really think that if I wasn't exceptional at what I do, I'd be sitting in this chair right now?" Her lips parted slightly, but before she could respond, he kept going. "You think I got here because I played the diversity card? Or do you think I got here despite everything designed to keep me out?" The silence in the room was louder than any of her previous questions. But Madeline wasn't done. Not yet. Because she had one last card to play, the one designed to break him. Madeline took a slow breath, shifting in her seat just enough to make it look casual. But Darius saw it, a crack in the facade. She glanced at her cue cards again, then set them down. This next part she wanted to deliver directly. "Darius," she said, tilting her head slightly, "I think it's fair to say you're passionate about this, and I respect that. But let me ask you something." Darius gave a slight nod, waiting. "Do you think some of this outrage is exaggerated?" She paused, letting the words settle. "After all, your success story proves that the system isn't as stacked against black entrepreneurs as some claim." The audacity. Darius could feel the heat creeping up his spine, but he didn't let it show. Instead, he let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "You know," he said, voice measured, "it's funny how people love to use one success story as proof that a problem doesn't exist." Madeline's smile stayed put, but something in her eyes flickered. Darius leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. "Let me put it this way. If one person climbs out of a burning building, do you point at them and say, 'See? The fire wasn't that bad'?" Madeline opened her mouth, hesitated, then closed it. Darius wasn't done. "The fact that I made it doesn't mean the system isn't broken. It just means I fought twice as hard to get through it." He let his words settle. Even the studio crew had stopped moving. Madeline adjusted in her seat, reaching for a controlled response. "I understand your perspective, but let's talk about another side of this." She turned toward the cameras slightly, her voice adopting that carefully neutral tone used for damage control. "Some might say your frustration isn't really about race," she continued, "that it's about resentment toward larger corporations. After all, you've publicly criticized big tech companies for not hiring more diverse executives." Darius tilted his head. "Resentment? No. Accountability? Absolutely." Madeline pressed her lips together for a beat. "Then what do you say to those who believe that in today's economy, success is based on hard work, not race?" Darius exhaled through his nose, then locked eyes with her. This was it. The moment. "I say," he began, "that people love to believe in fairy tales when they're the ones benefiting from them." A ripple of silence washed over the set, the kind of silence that sticks. "But let's be real," he continued, voice steady. "Black entrepreneurs still get denied loans at twice the rate of white business owners. We still receive less than 2% of venture capital funding. And even when we prove ourselves, we still get asked whether we deserved our success." Madeline sat still, listening, but not necessarily hearing. "So let's stop pretending the system isn't rigged," Darius said, his voice calm but firm. "It is, and the only people who don't see it are the ones it works for." Silence. Pure, heavy. Silence. The producers didn't cut to commercial. The control room didn't intervene. This was raw. Madeline shifted slightly, finally looking uncomfortable. She opened her mouth to speak, but Darius wasn't finished. Because this was the moment that would send shockwaves across the country. Madeline cleared her throat, glancing briefly at the off-camera producers, but there was no rescue coming. She had walked into this, and now she had to sit in it. Darius adjusted his watch, letting the silence linger just long enough to make people squirm. Then he leaned back in his chair, exhaling. "You know what the real problem is?" he said, his voice quieter now, but somehow heavier. Madeline hesitated. "What?" Darius didn't blink. "The bar isn't in the same place for everyone." She shifted slightly. "Meaning?" "I mean," Darius said, "a mediocre white man can fail upwards in this country, but a brilliant black man has to jump through flaming hoops just to get a shot." A producer off camera cursed under their breath. They knew this was going viral. Darius kept going. "A white CEO can run a company into the ground, bankrupt it, lay off thousands of employees, and somehow get hired somewhere else. Meanwhile, a black CEO has one bad quarter, and suddenly it's proof that we weren't ready for leadership." Madeline opened her mouth to respond, but he wasn't done. "And the best part?" Darius chuckled dryly. "When we actually make it, people like you sit across from us and ask if we got here because of some special advantage." Silence. Madeline's jaw tightened. It was subtle, but the camera caught it. Darius leaned forward just slightly, not aggressive, just firm, just final. "You wanted to talk about fairness?" He let out a soft, bitter chuckle. "Then let's start by telling the truth." Another silence, but this one was different. It wasn't discomfort anymore. It was impact. Madeline's expression had shifted. It wasn't just the audience watching Darius now, it was the entire country. And then, the moment. Darius turned slightly, looking straight into the camera. "I know what some of y'all are thinking right now," he said. "Some of you are nodding, because you've seen this, lived this." He let his gaze hold. "And some of you are sitting there, frowning, arms crossed, telling yourself this isn't real, that I'm just playing victim, that it's all in my head." His lips pressed together for a second before he finished. "But deep down, you know I'm right." The studio was silent. No one breathed. And then, "All right, we need to take a quick break," the producer's voice crackled over the speakers. Madeline forced a polite smile. "We'll be back with more after this." The cameras cut. But the damage was done. Within an hour, clips of the exchange were everywhere. But the real storm was only beginning. The clip hit social media like a wrecking ball. By the time Darius was in his car, his phone was blowing up. Texts, missed calls, notifications flooding his screen. Twitter was on fire. Darius Bell just exposed the media's bias on live TV. This was powerful. #Truth hurts. The way he looked into the camera and called out America, chills. And Darius Bell was right. But not everyone saw it that way. Here we go again, another successful guy pretending to be oppressed. Cry me a river. Stop the victim mindset. Wow. This guy just proved why people don't like hiring activists. Play the race card all you want, but hard work speaks louder. Merit matters. Cable news picked it up within the hour. Some called him brave, others called him angry and combative. By lunchtime, the Morning Exchange released a carefully worded statement. "We value open dialogue and diverse perspectives. While today's discussion became more intense than expected, we stand by our commitment to fair conversations." Darius laughed when he read it. Fair. Right. His assistant Tasha called him, her voice half laughing, half exasperated. "Do you realize you just set the internet on fire?" Darius rubbed his temple. "Wasn't exactly my plan." "Well, congrats. You just became the most talked about entrepreneur in America." He didn't respond. He knew what came next. Because viral moments don't stay just moments. They become battlegrounds. And the next 48 hours were about to get messy. But this wasn't just about him anymore. By the next morning, the story had exploded beyond social media. Cable news anchors debated it on live television. Opinion pieces flooded every major publication. Everyone had an angle. Fox News. Is Darius Bell the new face of corporate entitlement? CNN. Darius Bell's viral moment. A reckoning for America's meritocracy? Business Insider. What Darius Bell's interview reveals about race and success in America. Meanwhile, Madeline Royce was in damage control mode. On her show the next morning, she gave a carefully rehearsed response. "I respect Mr. Bell and his accomplishments, but I stand by my questions. My job as a journalist is to ask what the audience is thinking. If my questions were uncomfortable, that only proves how necessary they were." Translation. She wasn't backing down. Darius watched from his office, shaking his head. Tasha sat across from him, scrolling through emails. "You know," she said, "we just got a flood of new investor inquiries. People want to work with us." Darius smirked. "Let me guess. The same people who ignored us last year?" Tasha shrugged. "Guess being controversial is good for business." But it wasn't all positive. Some clients pulled out. A major corporate partner suddenly decided to re-evaluate their commitments. And then came the death threats. Emails. Phone calls. Even an unmarked package left outside Innovis headquarters. Nothing inside but a single sheet of paper, with one word written in bold. Enough. Tasha frowned as she read the message. You need security. Darius let out a slow breath, rubbing his temples. He knew this would come. Any time a black man speaks too boldly, too unapologetically, this is the cost. But backing down was never an option. And now, he had a decision to make. Would he let the backlash silence him? Or was this just the beginning of something bigger? Darius sat in his office, staring at the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The past 72 hours had been a whirlwind. Praise, backlash, threats, opportunities. He thought about his younger self, the kid from Birmingham who had to fight for every inch of success, the one who watched doors shut in his face while others walked through without knocking. And now, here he was, at the center of a national debate he never asked for, but one he couldn't ignore. Tasha entered, her expression unreadable. We just got an offer. Darius raised an eyebrow. From who? She set a folder on his desk. A network. They want you to do a televised special, a one-on-one deep dive about race, business, and the system. Darius exhaled. So now they want to listen. Tasha smirked. Seems like it. Then, after a beat, what do you want to do? He leaned back in his chair, thinking. He could walk away, let the noise die down, get back to business. Or he could use this moment, not for clout, not for attention, but to say the things nobody wanted to hear. Darius picked up the folder, flipping through the proposal. Then he set it down. He looked at Tasha. Tell them I'll do it. Her eyes widened slightly. You sure? He nodded. Yeah, but on my terms. Because if the system was going to put him under a spotlight, he was damn sure going to control the narrative. Darius Bell's viral moment wasn't just another internet controversy. It was a reckoning. It forced a conversation people had been dodging for decades, about race, about success, about who gets to rise without question and who gets questioned when they rise. Some called him an activist, some called him arrogant, some called him right. But one thing was certain. Nobody could ignore him anymore. So, what do you think? Does success mean playing by the rules of a broken system? Or does it mean rewriting the rules entirely? Let us know in the comments. And if you believe more stories like this need to be told, subscribe.